It'll just magically be live suddenly. I think we're live. Okay, cool. Hello, everybody. I was joining about the stream, about streams. Please stream it at home while we talk about streams on our stream. And so this one's going to be a slightly different flavor. We're going to have Manu do a demo of Qwik streaming. We're probably going to argue about what the definition of streaming even is, because every framework uses it differently. HTML streaming versus JSON streaming versus what are the trade-offs. And I want to, in particular, encourage everybody today to drop questions in the chat like crazy, because we don't have an agenda for this. We just want to show you what we've got going on with Qwik. I want you to ask your questions. And I would say there's everything from, what we observe others doing, which we think is interesting. And we've already come up with things that we want to research more to verify if some are doing it this way versus that way in a little bit more detail. There's what Qwik does today, and there's what Qwik is capable of doing in the future with this sort of unique HTML first approach. So really excited about this one. With all that said, Manu, want to take over?
Yeah, sure.
Should we jump to your screen, or do you want to speak to us first?
No, I think we can share my screen in the meantime. So I think, I know, kind of like the frameworks, like we try to, like all the frameworks are talking about the streaming. And I think, fundamentally it's a way to deliver content as soon as possible, right? That's kind of the thing. And there are different ways. So I'm just going to show like a very simple demo on how it's supposed to work, like in most of the frameworks today, and what we can do a bit different. So in this, we have this app. We have the streaming, just the streaming is the name of the component. And we have several components here, and it's defined like this. Notice that we take text and some delay. This is important for the demo because we are using this delay to artificially, make this component kind of take some time to load. Just like maybe you have some sort of fetch here, and it's taking, the delay that we specify. So this instance will take in 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, right? And the oldest one, like the last one, 3 seconds. I'm going to just put 5 here. It makes more sense. So if we open this application, right, the browser will be hanging here. Like they will be doing all this work to finish the whole HTML, and then when it's finished, right, it will just push the whole thing. Like it happened right now, and in that time, you don't know if it's working or whatever, right? So first, let's check. So right now, I'm disabling the streaming, which by default is enabled. So let's just enable it back. I'm just going to put this configuration, which is it's a bit better for demo purposes, and see.
I think you left the fetch in your source code.
And to be clear, so what you're saying is like, let's say that you had a 5-second database call. That's just the default of what basically frameworks, whether it's Django, WordPress, whatever you name it, Next.js, that's the default. Is like the server is waiting for that HTML to be generated. It's waiting. The user in the browser is waiting on that response to happen, is what you're saying.
Yeah, exactly. So with this change, right, we get this. And one of the most exciting things about this is that Qwik is doing this without any sort of JavaScript. So how is that even possible? Let's just disable it. So disable JavaScript. So there's no JavaScript at all. I'm just going to open the network tab and refresh, right? So here it's literally streaming the HTML. Like the HTML is not finished downloading. The server is still pushing like the little parts of the component, the partials of the component. So we are able to put into the network the streaming component in parts. Like first we can put this one, then this one, then this one. And this is not something that we do for only components. Like it's not something that you can do at the component level. It's something you can do even at the div level, right? Or the text level, right? So here we have a delay component, just a promisify of set timeout. And we run this, right? It's going to be even for these divs, which are not components, right? They are just like little things. It's going to be pushing. And we call this in order streaming. And it's something that, from what my understanding, not many frameworks can do today, or I don't know if you guys can confirm or not, but what I hear is that Marco 6 or I don't know if it's the last one or one of the existing ones can do this, but none of them, right? And we will talk later what the other frameworks call as a streaming, right? Before we jump into more conversation, I want to show something more, because I can imagine that a lot of people are thinking, oof, this is too much, right? Like you have fetch and things are going to be showing up and blinking and random ways. And actually, it doesn't have to be. And we have this API, which I think is super cool. And you can say, actually, I want to make sure that these two things get pushed to the network, like get pushed to the stream when it finished, right? So you don't want to have like half done. I can imagine this might be useful if you have in your landing page, the hero maybe section that you don't want to send to the network like kind of half done. So you want to make sure that all that is pushed as a single unit. And then from that on, it's not visible, it's not in the viewport. You don't care, you just want to push content as soon as possible. So let's check that out. So now it will wait a bit longer, right? But it will push this and these two together, and then it will be the 3 and 4. So let's check it out. 3, 4, 5, right? And of course you can have more. They can be nested. They can wrap several components or not component at all. So I'm just going to do this one just for, let's see, I'm going to wrap it around the 4 and 5. Let's check it out. It's going to be 1, 2, 3, and then 4, 5. Right? And I think, well, I think it's super cool. I don't know. I just feel like the ability to just control, like extremely, like we get to the point where we can ship like individual divs, right? Now is where, especially the Qwik team, we are starting to think how we can actually, now that everything is so spread, like in the finest grain possible way, how we find the best strategies, right? I think that's what is going to be the next week and the next month, and trying to figure out the best performance and visual things we can do with this.
Yeah, this is so super cool. I think what the demo, I mean, what we're kind of showing here is that at the lowest level, like Manu said, we have extreme control of every single chunk byte that you want to send back. And so Manu's demo here is showing like you can control at the div level, at the text level of what comes back. But out of the box, we're going to be able to provide, the defaults are going to be that like the first kilobyte or the first 30 kilobytes would be the first chunk, right? Like this is all the stuff that would be, we're going to come up with the best defaults possible, but you have all the knobs you need to kind of change it. They're like, well, in my site, I want to render the product page as fast as possible. I want to render the product data, but the add to cart can come in a second later. So like it's up to the developer to decide how they want to stream things in.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, please.
I just want to mention,
remove this in the meantime.
Oh yeah, if you don't want to screen share, let's do this. So just a couple of things. I'd love to run through a couple of the questions here, and also just mention a use case example, maybe two, to put it into perspective, because I know the blue boxes, I mean, it's fascinating to see sort of things dynamically loading from pure HTML. It's fascinating to see that there is no JavaScript involved. So this is not suspense. I mean, depends on what you think suspense is, by definition broadly, but it's definitely not like how React does this. This is just HTML. And a lot of it, and maybe we could touch on it in a minute, is powered just by HTML comments, which I think is fascinating, or maybe I know it was, I assume it still is. But just so people know, like to translate in your minds, like what are the common use cases for this? I know one really common use case. If you take an e-commerce site, it's very frequent that you will have a header that's standard for everyone. It could be statically generated. Like that thing may not even have to re-render on the server ever. It's just produced once. It's HTML. And then you might have a hero section that similarly is probably quick to load, the same for everybody, or maybe light personalization. A really common thing that we see, though, is somewhere on a page, a product page, collection, or home page, or whatever, there's a personalized set of products. There's one unit on the page that's unique to every single visitor, and it's slow to query. It's not just like coming out of cache. It is like, wait, assemble this unique set of products on a per visitor basis. So traditionally, you would have to load the fast parts of the page, then download all your JavaScript, then fetch the data, then render that piece with JavaScript. But with this approach, you actually will see your page instantly. And then probably by the time you scroll, HTML will have loaded for the follow-on sections. And this will start getting into, I mean, maybe we can go into a question because this is related. Because
I want to Steve point out
go
that
ahead.
this is very SEO friendly, right? Like
Yes.
there are very little trade-offs. Like in Qwik, you can actually disable this like configuration object. You can do with the streaming blocks. The very little trade-offs of this is that this is still HTML, right? This will work without JavaScript. It will work on SEO. Google, it will just deal with it normally. Any tool will just analyze this HTML normally. There's nothing like magic going on. It's literally, maybe later we can talk about how it works, but it's still like HTML. Like there is not anything else. Please go with the question. Let's go with the question.
Exactly. So yeah, let's go into this one because I think this starts to touch on out of order streaming a bit. Like one example that came up is header loaded, hero loaded, but maybe there's a number of items in your cart that's unique to you and it takes a second longer to fetch and load. So what happens if we want out of order streaming? Could Qwik support out of order streaming? If it does out of order streaming, does it require tons of JavaScript? Can you tell us about that?
So maybe you can go back to the demo. I can post it there. So because this is a good question. And so I'm going to remove the stream blocks. It's a bit easier because this is the render handles this and took a while to get it right. So the question was basically, well, this is easy, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But what happens if this actually takes 1 second, right? So again, with in order streaming, what we are showing now, no JavaScript enable. Oops. So if we refresh, so what is going to happen is that 1, 2, 3, and then the 5th is going to be instant, right? Because even though we are not doing it in serial, like all these components start to execute at the same time. So it's not like we execute because that will be terrible for performance, right? Like this, if we start one after another, this will take 4, like almost 10 seconds, more or less, right? With a bit 11, 12. It will take 12 seconds to load the whole thing. So we actually start loading at the same time. But if it's not kind of in the in order moment to go directly to the stream, we kind of buffer it. And when it's time, it's already rendered, right? And we just push it immediately. So that will be kind of in the in order. But then maybe we can introduce the out of order, which will require some JavaScript, right? But at least for the demo that we showed before, that's how it will work.
So can I jump in here with a little context? Sorry.
So basically, the out of order is like absolutely be able to support that too. So like my opinion, like the harder of the two is to be able to do the HTTP streaming. But now we have all the parts in place, how the components works, how each component itself is able to be async. We can then also do the out of order, and so that it can stream or create this shell immediately respond to the shell, and then the add to cart thing, which actually may not have to be part of SEO, it can come in a second later. That can then pop back in, which could be in the header, it was already streamed, or the HTML for that button is already there. But yeah, like the out of order stuff can then pop into.
Sorry, what I wanted to add over here is hopefully the mic is working because I'm messing with the settings a little bit here to make the background noise a little lower. What I want to add is that when we originally talked about Qwik, we made a point that Qwik has a synchronous rendering pipeline. And it's one of those things that's super hard to kind of explain, but now you kind of get to see what really this enables, right? If you look at other rendering frameworks, what they have to do is that they're fully synchronous, meaning that once the rendering starts, everything has to happen synchronously. There's no async block points. And so when there is an async block point, it's more of a kind of a workaround where the frameworks just like render best they can, and they finish that rendering cycle. And then when the promise resolves, then they do a secondary render from the very, very beginning, as if it started from the beginning, right? The point here with Qwik here is that Qwik actually considers the whole thing a single rendering event. It just so happens that there are asynchronous points inside of it, so even though it is asynchronous and things happen lazily, as far as Qwik is concerned, the whole thing was a single render event. And so the big difference here is that Qwik understands this on a lowest possible level, right? It's not like an afterthought of like, oh, we should probably figure something about streaming, so like add some kind of primitive or something to the framework afterwards. It is the way the framework is designed from the very, very core. and it's really hard to explain, but it is the thing that actually enables all of these magical things to happen.
I think this reminds me of the suspense, no, API. It was one of the questions. Like, this is not suspense. Like, actually, suspense has this a lot of problems, right? And it's kind of because render in React needs to be synchronous, and then suspense with the concurrent mode is integrated with the stream mode, and they can kind of do this replacement. This is different. Like, the Qwik can stop at any point, and this actually have you don't have to use suspense, right? It just naturally happens. It's kind of like the language. I recall in starting writing Go by the first time, and pretty much if you write Go, you write every Go statement with an await. It's like await is always there. It's like everything is asynchronous, right? Every single statement. I think kind of also like what Qwik happens here. And one of the very exciting things is that, for example, in suspense, you have this this thing where the pending state has to be within the suspense. Right, like that's one of the comments that, or discussions, is like, suspense is great, but maybe this is loading, but they want to show the loading thing here. That's a perfectly common thing. Like, you don't want to, if the component is loading here, I don't want to necessarily show the loading here. Maybe it's here, but I want to show it in somewhere other place. In Qwik, this just naturally happens because it's just some state, and you can just subscribe to it, and can be another component the other side of the page that has this pending state. And it just naturally fits, right? And because what Mishko said, we start to think about this from the very beginning.
Yeah, it really is crazy. Some people may not be fully aware of sort of how at the low level sort of the React 18 streaming works and stuff like that. But, for sake of comparison, when I'm using, I'm most familiar with the Hydrogen project. And the thing that people may not be aware of is with a React 18 project like Hydrogen, you will effectively get a blank page at first. You might have it's kind of funky. So you've got client components that can turn to HTML and can be sent immediately as soon as they're ready. Yet those need to hydrate. So you're going to download a bunch of JavaScript and re-render it in the browser anyway. Subsequently, you're going to download the entire React library, and then you can start fetching JSON. JSON is what then will start streaming, and you could stream in with JavaScript other parts of the page. That's a many step process to actually be able to see your page. Whereas what we really want, and what obviously Qwik's primitives play really well here, is we want, when I request your server, I just want you to stream the page, not a piece of it, and then a bunch of JavaScript, and then the JavaScript makes a request, and then we get some stuff, and then we render it manually. That's not what we're looking for these best practices on performance. And that actually reminds me of, so we had some other good questions here. So one that came up, I'm going to have to search through. We have so many comments here. It's awesome. So the edge, right? One of the questions that's very valid here is, why is everybody talking about streaming so much? It seems like in the way past, we all assumed all requests would go to some origin server around the world. And that was a very slow round trip and had all sorts of downsides. So we moved everything to the edge via static generation and caching. So you have a pre-computed something and everybody sees the same thing. Now with the proliferation of edge computing and the adoption of it, we want to start dynamically, rearranging and sending content from the edge. And I think that's sort of one of the best use cases here as well, which is at the edge, you're grabbing fragments of HTML, you're making final fetches, and you're streaming the end result so you can have individualized high performance pages, across the board. We have another couple good things. So here's one question. Is this comparable to Astro's client idle? And this is a good question for Mon. Are you familiar with Astro's client idle?
Yeah. So client idle in Astro is more about the hydration of it, like when it happens, right? Because in Astro, right, you need to still hydrate the application, the React component or the Angular, whatever you use, and it needs to happen at some point. So if I recall correctly, Astro has this client visible, client load, client idle, right? That's actually, this is not to do with the streaming, even though now they have, or they claim they have some of this. I think it's unrelated. This is more about you get the HTML, and then after a request idle callback, some JavaScript is going to load to update something or to hydrate something so it becomes interactive. This, to start with, is not a problem in Qwik because we don't have the hydration, so that doesn't even require, right? In the other demo that we have with Qwik React, we actually have a very similar API. We have this literally the same, like client visible and client idle. And Quick React is the one that is going to partial hydrate React. No? So I think it's more about that than streaming.
I got one good one. This one is for Adam. I'm excited about this one. How does this play with resources? Actually, it's probably for Adam or Manu, but Adam, on the Qwik City side, I'm curious your take, and then maybe Manu has more to add.
Yeah, I think what's been a lot of fun in this is that as Manu is building out the streaming stuff and I was building out Qwik City, that everything really started to fit together just naturally. And so, Manu created the resource, being able to use resource, and then with Qwik City, we needed to be able to have, get the product data, but we needed to get the product data on the server side. But I also wanted to render a shell while we waited for it. And so then this natural progression happened of just like, well, while we're waiting on the database call, inside of the code that you write, we can have the use endpoint, or what's called use endpoint today. And that's what kind of just naturally held everything up. So there really wasn't any, custom Qwik City code that needed to happen here, but we just kind of used the primitive of what this use resource was able to provide.
Yeah, no, it's indeed the demo I saw. It was using use resource with the delay inside.
Yeah, and then Qwik City wraps that and basically is able to. It knows what endpoint to call. It just knows to call the same page it's at, but use a different request header of I only accept JSON data. And so that's one thing that Qwik City provides, is that each of its routes is you can get it as HTML or you can get it as JSON, and that's what simplifies a lot of things too.
We should mention about the if Mieszko, you want to say
I was just going to jump in and kind of point out that a lot of other meta frameworks are really sitting on top of existing frameworks, and so as a result, they are limited in terms of what they can do. Like if the underlying framework doesn't support a particular feature, it's not like you can. I mean, at best, you can kind of create a workaround at the higher level, right? And you can't really solve it in a kind of the proper way, or whatever that means. It's kind of a wavy statement. But this is the kind of the point of Qwik, is that we want to solve these things at the fundamentally the lowest possible level, right? And the realization you have is that the framework needs to understand this, right? Like streaming is not something you can add after the fact. Like the framework at its lowest possible level needs to understand that like data doesn't just magically show up on a client. There's some streaming that's going on. And therefore, it has to have primitives for it, and it has to have boundaries and way of describing like what is your intention as a developer. Anyways, I'm kind of talking in circles here, but like I really want to get the point across that unless the framework actually understands this and allows these things to be expressed, there are very limited things you could do at the higher level as a meta framework to kind of work around these problems.
Yeah, and that's what's been fun about Qwik City is that first and foremost, to say that we're absolutely inspired, by Next.js, Astro, you name it, Gatsby, all of them. Like they've done, it kind of forged a good path of like what a good meta framework looks like, file-based routing, things like that. So absolutely inspired by a lot of that. But a lot of them, like what Mieszko is saying, is like they're using React, and so they're limited by what React can do. And so because of that, they have get static props, or having a loader function or a load function in SvelteKit. So they all have some sort of way to get this data to then give to this framework and let the framework do its thing, and then we'll catch back up to what the framework did and render that. And so each one has this custom name for what that process is called. With Qwik, we're able to say like, oh, you mean an on-get request? You mean like, so we're able to go even lower than that. I'm just like, oh, I know what you're just trying to do a get request. So let's like, now that you're doing that, we know what that does. Let's go get the data, and then let's give it to the framework. And the framework is then everything Manu was showing. Is like we're able to break that up to the HTTP stream, right? And so that's how low level we can get. And it's kind of fun because Qwik City is largely a build time tool, and the runtime is, I don't know how many lines of code. It's about 200 lines of code, because there's really not much to it at all, because it's really just using the primitives of what Qwik can provide. And then beyond that, Qwik itself, a lot of its JavaScript is never ran at all. And so that's just this huge advantage of it, is that Qwik City is largely a build time tool, and then Qwik itself is not going to be executing the JavaScript, just because that's the nature of how Qwik works.
I can slip in a quick preview too. I know you're down to say something, Manu. I'll pass you, I promise. we're creating a benchmarking tool right now, loading up all of the popular frameworks or ones we find interesting too. So we have a setup where we can create starters and small applications with, what is it? It's Next.js, Remix, Nux2, Nux3, Astro, Marco, Solid Start, Svelte Kit. I'm missing a couple, I know. I added Fresh. And what we could do is we can load up those servers. We can run Puppeteer on them, Lighthouse, get metrics. And I've been able to verify, I mean, there's only 3 frameworks that are 0 kilobytes by default. Basically, you could tell all other frameworks started as a JavaScript framework first, and they're trying to retrofit to server side. But 3 frameworks are 0 kilobytes by default, which is Qwik, Marco, and Astro. And so a lot of what we're talking about definitely relates to Marco too. Marco was definitely the first to say, server side first, streaming first, HTML first, and compile out to small JavaScript as needed. And I'm enjoying running these tests a lot because Qwik and Marco are ranking the best on these metrics. The other sort of middle ground is Astro that kind of says client-side rendering is not our problem, right? If you want to do server side, cool. If you want to do client side, raw JavaScript or choose your framework. And, funny enough, we really wanted to do that with Qwik too. Mishko was totally like, I don't want to build a renderer. I want to utilize what's out there. And it just came down to that point where there was just no rendering system that can match sort of this next generation of where these things are going. So we had to do it. And we also wanted to utilize other meta frameworks and couldn't too. And anyway, Mano, you take over. That's all I want to
No,
throw
this
in.
reminds me what Ryan mentioned also with the reactivity. Like he, in the previous stream, he mentioned how at the beginning he built this reactivity library. And he was like, oh, I don't care too much about the render. And then, but then it becomes very impossible. There is one framework that supports it better for the others. At the end, it becomes like the only solution, right? At some point, you start to think, okay, I'm going to create something custom that takes the most benefit out of it, right? So you always end up with, yeah, maybe this ideal world, like maybe you don't do it, but at the end, you kind of are forced to also tackle this problem. Before said Mishko and Steve, Steve and Adam about the other meta frameworks, how they solve this problem with the loader. I think it's super interesting because in the other frameworks, like the way you render is like you walk, or if it's a VDOM or whatever, is synchronous, right? So if you have at any point any asynchronous stuff, like there is 2 strategies, right? If you have any asynchronous stuff, you either just keep it and kind of queue it for the next and a second render kind of deal, or you remove any async, right? And that's what the meta frameworks do. They just put all the async before the rendering, right? So that's the get static props. In get static props, you can do all the way you want, and you get to a point where all the data is set, and then you render synchronously, right? That's kind of like how all the React frameworks, meta frameworks work, and the Svelte kit also work this way. And it has good things because you can load data. You can start the Mongo request very early. That's good, right? You can start rendering very early. In Qwik City, we also do that, right? Because we like that idea that you can start doing that request, that get static props as soon as possible, right? But the very interesting thing is that we don't wait the render. Like we can actually start in parallel. We can start the render and the get static props at the same time, right? So we start to work as soon as possible in both ways, like in the React, in the get stat, in the data and the rendering. And then when the render actually gets to the point where it needs the data, the render just waits there. Right? Just can patiently wait and then keeps going, right? So I think the thing is that if you have 2 things that take this amount of time, in Qwik you can get only this, right? And in the other frameworks, you basically get this one because you have to get the data and then render. And we can kind of do that in parallel. And I think also we are taking some of the good ideas from these meta frameworks, but taking to a next level because we still can start rendering and then await. So I think that's super interesting. It was one of the design considerations in Qwik City recently.
Yeah, and if it's not totally apparent, I mean, one of the really cool things here is everything is obviously interactive immediately. Now, if the client JavaScripts, the snippets haven't fetched, it will fetch. But unlike certain implementations using certain legacy frameworks, in certain situations with certain legacy frameworks, just because you see HTML doesn't mean you can click on it. You can click and it's not, there's nothing there to respond to you. It still has to flush through the whole application and download the whole application. Whereas with Qwik, you click that button immediately And if it's not already prefetched, you will just get the tiniest bit of JavaScript to respond to that event, which is pretty cool too. I do think now is maybe a good time. I mean, first of all, anybody tuning in, please throw more questions in there. And also worth correcting what Oren pointed out is fresh is also 0 kilobytes by default. And actually, if you're talking about kilobytes JavaScript that could be pre-generated on the page as opposed to downloaded, Qwik technically is about 1, just about 1, a little under 1. We'll have I'll just call it sub 1. We'll have some benchmarks coming out, but it's kind of cool to see. Yeah, Mishko?
I was just going to say, it depends on how you measure, whether you measure gzip or non-gzip, all these things, but somewhere around 1.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's the funny thing too. I can't wait to share the results of this because we're seeing kind of what you'd expect is actually, I can even rephrase what I'm saying. If you count just JavaScript in general, may or may not be downloaded, like may or may not be in a script tag inlined. But JavaScript in general, Qwik will basically have 1 kilobyte. And if your app's really big, it'll be 1. And if it's massive, it's 1. And if it has tons of interactivity, it's 1. Tons of third-party apps, it's 1, etc. With the others, we're already seeing what I'd expect, which is 0 kilobytes for a few. It's about 50 to 100 kilobytes for some other frameworks, say like the Next Remix and Nuxt. And it's about only 10 or so for Svelte and Solid.js. But what you do see is as applications grow, like you've got a simple to-do app, and then you've got an application that imports other things and has a significant amount of JavaScript involved, you'll see a pretty clear line. What's fascinating, and we'll share the results soon, is all the frameworks kind of just linearly grow in weight and slowness as a result, right? The CPU being used, the network download capacity, stuff like that. And so it's funny to see a pretty clear line how all the frameworks trend on. Marco is a distinctly less of a sloped line because it is very smart about what needs to be included and what can be purely static. And then Qwik is just flat. And obviously with certain situations, maybe you do want some things to download immediately. And you can do that with like use client effect, but it's cool to see. Qwik is generally flat or like the teeniest slope, depending on sort of if you have a pretty niche situation, which is cool. But maybe it's now, I mean, anybody in the stream, please throw comments and questions. We definitely want to answer anything here. Oh, in fact, let's add one more. And then what I'd love to do is go a little bit more into the internals of Mono. You talk about how is this even implemented? Like it looks like magic under the hood. Sometimes it's neat to see sort of how this is powered through the HTML first approach using comments, etc. But Shai has a good question. Is there a way to measure the real performance benefit across networks beyond Core Web Vitals? So, I mean, I'll tell you what we're doing now, and I'm very open to feedback if anybody wants to throw it in the comments. So 2 points of view on this. One is not wanting to invent new metrics because then you have to fight with people about if it's a valid metric or not. And so mostly trying to delegate that to, we know Lighthouse is imperfect, but there is some consensus on there is a No, I'll get there. I promise. There is, some consensus on LCP matters, FCP matters, TTI matters. So maybe we don't call Core Web Vitals, we just call those some standard agreed upon metrics that matter. And then the way we're approaching this problem of actually measuring these across frameworks is we're using our open source framework Mitosis that can compile a subset of JSX, full-on applications and components, to relatively idiomatic code of all these frameworks. So it can output to React, Vue, Qwik, Solid, Svelte, Marco just was added, etc. And then we can spin up those applications and measure the Lighthouse scores, Core Web Vitals, the FCP, LCP, etc. So that's how we're approaching this. We're trying to actually create full-on applications that are relatively identical across frameworks and measure sort of how the these important metrics differ. And we're excited because as we start seeing more full-on frameworks built on top of Mitosis, which there's one coming out that's kind of like secret and will be announced, so we'll share that later. A few being developed more publicly. When we get to that point, I think we can start seeing full, almost real-world applications that we can fully load across frameworks and measure them. And from everything we've seen, Qwik really shines in this type of test. But we want to put it to the test. We want to actually make an open set of benchmarks, an open set of code, and let people, we'll chart all the results and let people go at it. Almost similar to those JavaScript framework benchmarks we're familiar with on render performance, the table row thingy where you can plot, the speed of everyone. We really want to do that for load times, which hasn't existed to date because it's a tricky one, but we've got some new tools to work with here. Maybe we can go into one more question. I have not read this one, but I'll just read it out loud if we do. Felix says, I've been always curious about what happens on a slow network when users interact with a semi-huge component that will need to download and execute after user interaction. Is this a problem? Who wants to take it?
I can take that. Actually, I just replied.
I knew it. I knew that Mishko wanted to.
I actually replied to Felix in the chat with a FAQ URL that actually kind of talks about it. But the general point is that yes, this would be a problem if you waited until the user interacted to start downloading, right? And so as a result, prefetching is an important part of Qwik. Prefetching basically says, start downloading the code as soon as possible. And at this point, you say, well, if you start downloading code as soon as possible, isn't that the same thing as existing frameworks? And the answer is no, for a couple of reasons. First of all, the amount of code that has to be downloaded is way smaller in Qwik. So Qwik understands the difference between static components and dynamic components, and understands the relationships, and understands, what things needed for re-rendering, what things are needed for interact with components. And so all of that comes together and basically gives us less code to download to begin with. The second benefit we get is that we download the code. Well, we don't need to execute the code until the user interacts with the page. Whereas existing frameworks, not only do they have to download the code, but actually have to execute everything. And it looks like the microphone's not working.
Microphone's working. Network quality is very poor. It's very choppy. Why don't Adam Romano, do you want to slip in and somewhat reiterate what Miško said? I knew because I kind of know what the words are, but I think those,
I think this is a very good question, because it's obvious, right? Like it's something that when you see, zero JavaScript, then what's happening, right? So I think probably Miško and I have different ways to explain it, but overall it's the same thing. It's first of all, we download, but we don't load the whole application, or even we don't download the components that are in the page. We only download the interaction that can happen. So if you even have an application and you use 100 components, but actually there is only one thing you can click, or that's the only thing you're going to prefetch, right? It's a function of the interactivity. It's not a function of the complexity of the application. It's not a function of the complexity of the page. It's a function of the interactivity that is possible and is visible. The other interesting aspect is that downloading is not the same as executing, right? So we don't execute the JavaScript. We just prefetch it. That leaves like a lot of room for getting the browser do the important thing first, right? And then when actually there is interaction, the code is there. And yeah, a slow network can be a problem, and it can be a problem for Qwik or any framework. I think it's less of a problem in here because just the amount of JavaScript don't allow is much lower, right? So in the other framework, you will have to kind of wait there to download it, and you will have the hydration, which is much bigger. Install all the components, needs to re-render, needs to do a lot of CPU time to get interactivity. So here at least you have less to download and then instant interactivity. So we think that the problem is much smaller. And we can even add that the strategies for prefetching, we can go nuts with that. Like all these individual pieces of code get like a unique ID. And we haven't built a demo yet, but you could literally take stats and collect this in BigQuery. Imagine you are a big customer of how these individual symbols, like we call symbols like the on-click, are being used in production in your real website. And you can actually prioritize and say, actually, no, like loading this thing here that no one clicks is not that important, but the buy button, that needs to be like the first thing to prefetch, right? So that's another thing in Qwik. Like even if not everything is prefetched, if you interact only with a thing that is prefetched, that will work immediately. So you have that kind of flexibility. And yeah, we haven't built that, but the symbols are, we work really hard to make the symbol names to be static. Right? So even you remember you change your code, the symbol names like still keep the same. So you can reuse it across builds. Yeah.
Yeah, and also one last thing to add is like the other thing that we have is all the prefetching capabilities. There's many ways to prefetch code. Many different strategies of how to do it. And so we've added to Qwik, as it stands, what's released today is the different ways that you want to do it. And so this is something that I'd love to get more research from the community of like, what's the optimal knobs to tweak of like, what's the best way to prefetch? And so we think we provide a lot of ways. You can use either webwork to prefetch, you can use the link element to prefetch, you can use JavaScript that adds a link element. I mean, there's many different ways to do it. And so like getting more research there of what we can provide as the best default would be awesome. And so we think we've got some good defaults now, but more research can be done there.
Okay, can I jump in? Hopefully the microphone is better. The quality is better. I tweaked some Wi-Fi settings here. I think what's kind of interesting to understand about Qwik is that Qwik actually has runtime information about the bundles. Like if you think about it, that's kind of weird and unexpected because most frameworks are like, bundling, not my problem, right? And so the framework itself really has no idea about what bundles exist, what are the relationship between bundles, and so on and so forth. Qwik is unique in the sense that when we generate the bundling system, we actually produce a file we call the manifest, and manifest is actually handed over to the runtime of Qwik. So when the Qwik is running, there are Qwik actually understands like what are the relationship between code and if you click on this button, what other code will have to be downloaded, etc. And so the fact that Qwik at runtime fully understands the structure of all the bundles, all the chunks that need to be downloaded, is really what enables Qwik then to go in and generate all these magical pieces and move things around and so on and so forth. And I think that's pretty unique.
100%. Should we there's two areas we can go down, and again, throw questions in the chat, anybody that you want to. We like them a lot. Two directions we go down. Out of order streaming, how is this implemented in the first place? Or even both. Manu, would you like to tell us a little bit more low-level details, like what is actually going on here? How is this possible with Qwik? I still love how you're using HTML comments and showing that. I think is pretty neat. Or any direction you'd like to take it?
You mean about the out of order or the in order, how it works?
Both,
Yeah,
honestly. I mean, I don't know if we really described the out of order in detail yet, and maybe it's better, in my opinion, might be better to understand it by knowing how it works anyway. So up to you.
So so what we have the in order, I think adding this functionality, we add this like last week. It was easy because kind of the framework already, like the render itself was already like deal with have await inside the rendering tree, right? So in pretty much all the frameworks, when the render function returns something, that's kind of it. That's the thing. Like with that, you have all the information to do the render. And in Qwik, you don't, maybe not, right? So every component is like a wait in a way, or you can actually have promises, right? You can have the same way you can put a string in the JSX, you can pass a promise, right? And they will wait in there. Like literally, if you put something before and after, that will happen in order streaming. So so it requires a different render. So before we have the DOM, we have a DOM render. That is the one used in the browser, but we also use this DOM render in the SSR, and we depend on a library called Domino, which is kind of like a server, like a DOM implementation that works in any JavaScript engine. So we have to implement a new render that doesn't depend on this, right? And can just literally connect with a stream API. So just like you can think of it as a function that takes a string, and wherever you have something okay, you just push it there, like a G. I don't want to say this word because Mishka's going to laugh. Yield in the generator, like a generator in a way, right? So the render becomes a generator, and it's basically just walking, but with awaits, right? And making sure that everything can work, right? And that's easy to say, but at the same time, like if you want to do it after, it's very complicated. I think it was easy for us to support this because we already have the async render that Mishka mentioned.
And regarding like Domino, like correct me if I'm wrong, Manu, is that still in main today? Like we're still using Domino right now, right? Or is that gone?
No,
okay,
it's gone.
Okay, it's just double checking.
It's for testing.
So,
we have it for testing internally, but not.
Yeah, so it's spitting out strings at a time on the server.
One interesting thing is that when we make this and we updated the doc side, it was funny because we actually start to see some, not flickering, but we start to actually see the streaming. Like you actually see the doc. Like sometimes, like if the website is long, it will like blah, 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 like very fast. But you could see, for instance, you can see like the paragraph, they were coming like in chunks, and I actually was like, this is not actually very good. And that's where we actually came up with. it's too good in a way, right?
Yeah.
Like the first byte is super fast, right? But that's where later we start thinking, okay, now that we can stream to the text level, like to the minimum thing, how we can make it, how we can now give control back and saying, actually, no, I want to stream, I want to buffer the first stuff, or I don't want to, I want to render at least the visible stuff, right? And from there on, I can stream, and all these different strategies, right? That we can
Yeah,
do
and
now.
so and that's the default that we're adding actually right now is that we're assuming like with the doc site to get that first visible area is about 20 25 kilobytes of code, and so we can give that default of saying like don't actually respond, don't have a completed response until you get at least buffered at least 25 kilobytes, and then respond with that. And then the rest of it, whether like it could be a huge document page that's 200 kilobytes, that can stream in, but that's already we're already viewing the locked in version, and so that's what we're going to go with. But again, that's a default. Developers can change all they want. It's like, no, I want to respond within 1 kilobyte. Or I want to respond immediately. They can change that default, or I want to wait until the whole 200 kilobytes is done. It's entirely configurable.
And or you can use the blocks too if there is specific parts even later that you don't want to break, right?
And then for out of order streaming, for like that use case where later on you want to actually insert something high up on the page, assuming, and people will ask like, oh, you don't want the page to layout shift. No, you would do this carefully. You'd make sure you have room, like the cart number would be a blank space and then a number would populate or whatever. But for implementing that, I know it's not something that's in core right now, but it is something that's sort of like in progress. Does that require, I mean, I know the answer, but I want people to know, does that require the entire framework to download? Do you need to download the framework? It knows how to render everything and then it can stream and stuff to the top? Or is there, how is it implemented in Qwik?
Misko, go.
I was gonna let you talk about it, but sure. So one of the cool things I think about Qwik is that we rely so much on HTML in the sense of like, it's HTML first, right? To us, HTML is the source of the truth. And we go from that. And this is where resumability comes from, and so on and so forth. And so what you can have is if you have JavaScript enabled, you can have teeniest amount of JavaScript. And what I mean by teeniest amount is something as simple as query selector a particular DOM element and do .inner HTML on it. Like it's not even a library. It's literally something we just generate on the fly. And what that allows you to do is you can say like, oh, I come across the thing that I don't have yet. That's fine. Let me just keep rendering afterwards. And then once the promise resolves, you can just generate essentially a patch, a tiny little piece of JavaScript that says like, oh, go query selector that item that I didn't have the value for, and now go update it with inner HTML and just continue rendering where you left off. And so the demo that Manu was showing, where all the items had to come from top to bottom, right? You have to go item 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so if there was an item that was slow, it kind of caused the pausing of the rest of them to show up. What you would see now is you would see 1, 2, maybe 5 would come in, and then come back to 3, 4, 5, and everything would kind of work out. Now, what's neat about it is that what happens if the user or the user of the page starts interacting with the page before the page is fully ready, right? Because that could happen. And the nice thing about it is that because we have these resources, the framework understands, even if it wakes up on a client, the framework understands like, oh, there's a resource over here, and this resource is really a promise, and this promise has not yet been resolved. And so what the framework can do is that if the framework hasn't kind of woken up, then we should just simply do an inner HTML. We patch that particular location. But if the framework wakes up, then the framework can kind of intercept and say like, I know you want to inner HTML this stuff, but let me get involved because I've already, processed some user interaction. And as a result, it's not as simple as just inner HTML. And so instead, let me intersect this over here and just give me the data, and then I will go and render it. And so the beauty of this thing is that you can have no JavaScript. Everything just renders correctly. I mean, the JavaScript for the tiny updates, but then you can have the user interact with the page before it's fully rendered, and it still will behave in the correct way because it's just resources that are being resolved.
And it might be worth adding like common use cases, a few more to just throw in people's minds, because the big question comes up: layout shifts, layout shifts. How do you avoid layout shifts if you're doing this type of technique? But it's interesting to realize the structure of websites. Commonly there are some pretty clear areas that this type of streaming technique could be really impactful for. So a lot of our examples are e-commerce. Now, Qwik and Builder and all these things are not solely for e-commerce, but we see some of the most egregious offenders of performance in e-commerce. You probably visited some sites on your phone where you're like, wow, I'm not going to buy anything on this site. It's just horrible to use. And so using e-commerce as an example, here's some simple examples, right? Let's say you've got a common page is, header, some kind of carousel, like a homepage. I know people hate carousels, but they exist. And then stuff below, right? So out of order streaming can populate a number of stuff without layout shifts. One could be, a lot of times when you open a cart, it slides in, you should expect to see all the items of your cart in there, but that's actually part of up on the page, right? That little drawer, the HTML for that drawer is high up on the page most of the time, but that's something that can easily patch in later. So you haven't clicked on the cart, but by the time you click on it, that has been patched in, the HTML is there, no client side anything was required. You don't like click on the cart and see a spinner and it's fetching. No, it is populated, but we didn't hold up any other part of the page. Other examples are the seconds through nth slides of a carousel. So your carousel is there immediately, but you can be loading other things later. Obviously, things low on the page are an easy one because people haven't scrolled, so they can load later, even in any order that they come in from. But also a common one is personalized areas of pages. So another common thing is sections of the page that generally have an expected height, but we actually do want them to come in a split second later because they actually are personalized to the visitor. If you shop menswear, you might see that the main hero be menswear products, menswear models, recommended of stuff, which again can just kind of fade in there a moment later, and you can be using the page already, which is pretty neat. Anyway, Mona, you want to jump in on this broad topic, so please take over.
No, I want to mention that indeed, like, this is something that you will not get. Like the default will be the inline order, right? In order, right? You will actually hear this side, and we have this the resource API. When we render a resource, it's a trade-off you will make as a developer, as a designer, right? Do we want to show like a placeholder and then update, or do we want to wait until it's done and not have like an update? It's something you can choose, right? It's not something that we make the decision for you and then you are like, oh, but this is not going to fit my use case, right? I just want to point that out because it feels like with when you actually render with suspense in React and you don't have the data, the suspense has to be at some place. Like if the rendering happens within the rendering, even if it's in one layer, it's like the whole page or something, the suspense needs to happen. You don't know where it happens, right? But it needs to happen at some. You have to put the suspense at any level. It needs to be there. Here, you do or you don't do, right? You can do the out of order or not do the out of order, almost per resource, per thing level.
Yeah, and I also wanted to just point out like the flickering effect that could happen. That's really not even a quick React anything problem. I mean, that's just just like if you had jQuery code and you wanted to insert something up higher, it's going to flicker, right? So that's just part of just web design, web development, of just like that little section that you want to have needs to be designed to say when I add something to it, I don't want it to change the layout. And so that's just core web development. And especially Steve's example was the best one of, well, if the drawer came sliding out, that's kind of already designed that it's not going to flicker when it pops in because it's already hidden. So
I want to just mention one thing about the out of order is that the way we are thinking about it in Qwik, I think is very interesting because it's not like it's not completely something completely new that like a feature that is like, oh, this is like a completely refactor. It still goes under the same principles of serializing something, right? And here we are actually serializing an unresolved promise or unresolved resource. So it's not like we are going to do something different or like a completely new part of the runtime. It's literally the same primitive of the serialization that we have in Qwik. But in this case, we are actually, we are serializing something that's not quite there yet. And the runtime will know how to deal with that. But everything else plays with it. Like you can subscribe to data that is not there. You can have reactivity for unresolved promise of the object that's going to resolve. There's a lot of things that that can happen at this level, and it it just naturally fits, which is what I find super exciting, because it's not like
Yeah.
now we are like scratching our head about how we are going to do this.
You're killing me. Okay, because I want to talk about the how Qwik City was working like a week ago. Was that the on get would happen. I would load the data, and then with that data, I would pass it to the use resource, and it would render it, things like that. And Manu, you contacted me. It's like, well, no, just give me the promise. I was like, yeah, but it's not done yet. And you're like, yeah, that's fine. And I remember like we redid the internals of Qwik City to make sure like, oh, all right, it's not a done thing. I'll just give you this promise for some reason. And I remember like loading the page without changing anything. It's like, oh, it just worked. Because like the core of Qwik was already waiting for promises. They already knew how to change it. And so like that was such a cool realization of just like, we can start kicking off all these promises, and then I just give it to the render, and the render knows what to do. Like it's not a Qwik City thing. It's just like the core of how Qwik works.
That's something people may or may not realize, and maybe we mentioned it before, but there's not a lot of magic in Qwik City. Like I asked on Twitter one time, what was it? I asked something, and somebody replied with, tell us about the amazing features and performance of Qwik City. And the point is actually, it's just a thin layer on Qwik. There's not a lot of features of Qwik City. In fact, if anybody wanted to create competing meta frameworks to Qwik City over Qwik, like you have a lot of tools to do it. We kind of encourage you to do it. I'd be curious actually what people would come up with and what would want to do in that situation. And maybe it necessitates it not being necessary, but we'll find out over time. Adam, you want to add something to that?
No, yeah, I just want to Qwik City. If you were to, put up the features of Qwik City versus Next.js and what features does it have versus SvelteKit, things like that, I don't think that's a very compelling, discussion, because really you can do that with every meta framework. They all are, for the most part, one for one. Like they really can all have the same features. They all have file-based routing. One kind of chooses this function name, one uses this syntax. But for the most part, I really think they're really close to the same. And I've spent a lot of time, researching every single one of them. And so like Qwik City itself is just like, oh, cool. It's the underlying framework on top of Qwik is what really makes it compelling, and all of the streaming capabilities and how fast it can load, not using JavaScript. That's the cool part about Qwik City.
I feel it like the electric car. It's like you have the car, and the electric car has the same features, but then you can say, oh, actually, maybe we don't need the transmission, or I don't know. I'm just saying, like in a way, it's kind of like in terms of features, like it's the same. Like we have the 4 wheels and the same kind of fundamental features, but then you realize that things can be done in a very different way or a vastly simplistic way and works. So I think like when we talk about Qwik, we don't want to sell the features, right? Because that will be a bit against the point that we are trying to make with the innovations there.
I like that. Felix is going to create a competing framework called QuickTown. And it's going to run in a web worker completely, like we talked about. It'll be the one that has the server and the service worker, and it just sends HTML up. I'm joking, but if somebody did want to do cool stuff, I mean, it's fun and we like to see it. I also like that Glenn said, in so few words, Qwik is the framework you don't have to think about, which is actually quite nice. I actually like that point of view personally, because when we start looking at these new techniques, I would say Marco is in this realm as well. But something like React server components is arguably a big offender of this. So you have to be very deeply aware of client component versus server component versus shared component, who can use where, and rules upon rules upon rules, and like trade-offs everywhere within the framework, as opposed to the idea of Qwik of just make components, we have you covered. And some people are, Mishka, you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I was just going to add is that I think the way it works in most frameworks is that you build your app, you're like excited, you start building up, everything goes fast in the way you build it, and at some point you're like, yeah, but my app is slow. It's like you take a pause and you're like, fine, okay, let me see if I can start debugging and figuring out the reasons and moving things around and putting whatever it needs to be to kind of improve the speed of the application, right? And the point we're trying to get with Qwik is that shouldn't be part of your workflow, right? Like the framework should just take care of it. Like you just build your app, and you shouldn't think about like, what is the best way for breaking it up? What is the best way to do lazy loading? What is the best way to do prefetching? What is the best way to make sure the browser streams correctly, right? You shouldn't have to think about any of that stuff. It shouldn't have to be an afterthought that you go in and do this. So, and as you point out, like it's this weird sell, right? To people, it's like, well, what does your framework do? Like the same thing that everybody else does. So why is it better? Well, you don't have to do this bizarre thing later on, which most people don't even kind of associate with. Like they just assume that like that's just a thing you have to do. And yet it is not. Like, that's the kind of the whole point of the Qwik, is that we just don't want you to have to think about it. Like, out of the box, you should just have prefetching, right? Out of the box, you should have lazy loading. Out of the box, you should just not send components that are not needed. Like, you shouldn't have to do anything as a developer. It's just should be just the way the system works.
And I want to say that it seems like we are saying like React is bad or something like this. And it's actually no, like we are inspired by the developer experience of authoring, right? Like I think that's what we wanted to bring, like the authoring of the components, like some of the very good things about React is this composability thing that Solid has, for example, as well, but Svelte doesn't, right? And it's also like Solid, it was like, oh, let's see how we do like a Svelte with the PX and authoring of components of React, because I think they get a lot of things right in that sense, and we are deeply inspired by that and the innovation in the meta framework that happened around it. Definitely.
100%. We're just up against time, so when I close out with this, one thing that I notice happens these conversations we get asked about sometimes is why do we hate JavaScript so much? When the library you write is with JavaScript / TypeScript, right? And you could probably take the one example as we mentioned. Like I mentioned cart. It's like, yeah, but you could just fetch the cart in JavaScript. Like, who cares? And I think the thing that, we're deeply aware of this group from the experience between Angular, Ionic, and other things, my background with shop style, it's either building the frameworks that build the large applications or building large applications on top of the frameworks. You find one thing always happens. When you just say, oh, JavaScript's the answer to that, and then you say it again and again and again, you die by 1,000 cuts. And you end up in this realm we're in today where, if you could find a decent scale website that's getting anything under a 10-second time to interactive, I'd be shocked. It's just crazy how poor these, Mishka's whole conference talk where he shows a bunch of data we pulled on it, but it's insane how long it takes for websites to actually be loaded and usable on a pretty average mobile device, average connection. And so we're really taking an extreme approach of just saying, like, we don't need JavaScript for hardly anything if you approach it right. And we're excited about it. We're excited to show over time how other stuff like personalization and micro frontends are solved, how it connects to tools like Builder, where part of the motivation of Builder was the marketing team at ShopStyle kept wanting JavaScript-based tools to personalize and JavaScript-based tools to A/B test. And I was like, oh my goodness, stop. This has to be HTML. So if I need to, I'm just going to have to give you marketers a tool to generate HTML or code for a framework that can deliver over an API. And the combination of these things, I think, it's exciting. And we're seeing more websites starting to be built with Qwik. And we're going to see some really exciting performance scores, some exciting results. Because it is hard to compare frameworks, like everybody said, when it's just Hello World versus Hello World. It gets a lot more interesting when you're comparing large-scale, real production applications where we really kind of seek to optimize Qwik for. And I think, Mishko, you want to jump in with one more thing?
So I was just laughing at the joke on about you being the host, and we just got rid of host. That's funny. But the thing I wanted to jump in is that a lot of times people are like, oh, but Qwik can only be used for e-commerce, or Qwik is only good for server-side kind of generated stuff, etc. I really want to make a point that Qwik is full-featured framework. Like, whatever you can do in Angular, React, Svelte, pick your favorite framework, you can also do with Qwik. So there isn't really any limitations in terms of like the kind of apps you can build using Qwik. But we are kind of focusing on e-commerce first, right? Because that's our bread and butter. So while many of these demos that we show off are e-commerce kind of first demos, or we talk about e-commerce or the server-side generated or prefetching and all these different things, there really isn't a kind of limit to like, it's just a general purpose framework that you can do anything else that you do with all the other frameworks.
Yeah, it's a little harder to speak to, but yeah, you could say it differently. As we really focus on websites where time to interactive matters a lot. So, like, does the gigantic 10 million line of code Google Cloud dashboard really need time to interactive? Is that going to make a huge difference on their business? Probably not. It doesn't hurt, but it's not like a go refactor everything tomorrow type of decision. But if you're Amazon.com, or if you're similar, like even take builder customers like Zapier, or I guess I forget, we're not allowed to name a bunch of the really big ones, but there's a lot of any company that's got a website that a consumer would go to essentially logged out needs to be fast. And so e-commerce is the easy one to point to, but there's an entire fintech, travel, SaaS, there's a huge amount. This really matters for content and media businesses too. You can go on forever, but hopefully that helps. We'll figure out a way to label it better than e-commerce, which is not perfect, but not totally far off either. And Adam, you had one more thing to say too?
Yeah, I was just going to say, because it does come up of like, oh, this is great for building sites or building pages in MPA, but And we never really have demos of massive dashboards, but you had said like the Google Cloud dashboard would absolutely be a perfect use case for it. Like it would load extremely fast because it has thousands of click listeners, has thousands of components, things like that. That again is the case of just like it'd have 0 JavaScript to get going, 1 kilobyte of JavaScript inline to get going, and it would render extremely fast. But that again, what we're trying to say is like it really doesn't matter whether it's this massive, single page application dashboard or a web page.
And even like most of the benefits you get it from like Qwik is fast because of the resumability. You don't have to do more work. Like you did it in the server and then in the client, you're pretty much done. That's why it's fast, right? But you can render in the client too. Like that's also like a misconception is that you don't need to have a server. Like you could just you put Qwik there and you just execute it in the client. You will not get any benefit of this, obviously, right? Because the application just needs to run. You start from an empty page. Everything will download. Well, not everything. Like we have to do the splitting, right? So maybe you even download less. So even in that case, it will be good. So even in that case, there is not a trade-off. Like Qwik, you need a server, or Qwik, you need a edge. Adam was working last night in the static site generation, right? Which doesn't require like an edge worker. So in that sense, is like another framework. There is not a trade-off like that. It's usually a misconception.
Yeah, and I think, Shai actually put it really well. Like the people who like badly need Qwik the most, in our opinion, are websites that are, for instance, search engine facing. Like really, it'll highly affect your rankings and the interaction your users will do. They'll bounce more for a slow website. They will spend less time on site. They will convert less, meaning they won't buy, they won't sign up, for this stuff. But also I would add to that list anything that is sort of anonymous visitor oriented. So you've never heard of Zapier.com, just go to Zapier.com. It loads instantly and you could just navigate around the site. You might say, hey, this is a tool I'd like to try a trial for or whatever. But what is interesting is you take for Builder, for instance, Builder has both of these things. Besides our own, the actual platform that people connect to and generate and load content from Builder on. We have our website, we have our blog, we have our docs, which are the first things we're going to move to Qwik because those just have to be lightning fast. They just have to be. And those are the most frustrating. This is also, I think, why Astro is solving what they're solving and Marco is it's really, really frustrating to just build an application that at the end of the day, ultimately is just a relatively static page, yet you're paying an enormous JavaScript cost for. And you're just like, why? Why are you loading so much JavaScript for my blog post? This is ridiculous. Why do I have to think about this? When I'm just trying to build components and ship an application, it should not be this difficult. But what's cool is we will be moving, I would say, in the later order, but probably more of the benefit in a certain sense. We'll be moving the Builder application over to Qwik too. And that'll be a really interesting sort of self-case study in the benefits of the more complex application. I can tell you right now, Builder's React app suffers from on a slower device, slower load times, higher memory utilization, stuff like that. And it's another one of those frustrating circumstances of, look, you've got a team of people building a React app. You have a company with an engineering team with a lot of performance expertise, yet the fundamental tools you're using really handcuff you and leave you with this application that you're not feeling as good performance-wise as it could be. And so, yeah, we'll start seeing as we move large applications over to Qwik, and we're talking with some other very large companies looking to do the same. And what we care about more than anything else is just results. Show me how fast everything will be. And so we're excited to start sharing those for the real production use cases soon. So anyway, why don't we close off of that? We went a little bit over because we just had so much stuff we're dying to say. Thank you, everybody, for joining in, asking great questions and stuff like that. It was really fun showing all this stuff to you. And join us next time. I still got to get back on what the topic will be next time, but we'll have a fun one next time. We'll see you.